My name is Emma, and I'm 32 years old. I used to think happiness was finding a man who loved me and wanted to build a home with me. I believed I had found that when I met Mark, a mature, gentle, and attentive man. Mark is 13 years older than me, a significant age gap, but his maturity and steadiness captivated me from the moment we met. Unlike anyone I'd ever known, Mark, at 45, was a successful, elegant, and warm man. Most importantly, he gave me a sense of security, a feeling I had always longed for. When Mark proposed, I didn't hesitate. I knew he had been through an unfortunate marriage, and I was ready to step into his life, even if it meant accepting Ethan, his son from his previous marriage. However, my initial optimism didn't last long. From the moment I moved into this house, I realized I wasn't just taking on the role of a wife, I was shouldering the burden of being a stepmother. Ethan, Mark's son, made no effort to hide his indifference and distance toward me. He was reserved, rebellious, and clearly unwilling to accept my presence in this family. Mark tried to smooth things over, but I knew he was in a difficult position. Ethan wasn't just his son, he was the shadow of a haunting past that Mark tried to keep buried. Mark had confided in me that Ethan's mother had died in a car accident 7 years ago, and Mark had been the driver. Though the incident was ruled an accident, Mark carried the guilt, believing he had taken Ethan's mother away from him. Perhaps that was why Mark went to great lengths to make amends to his son. But to me, those efforts felt like a burden on both of them. Not long after I moved in, I began noticing peculiar things about the house. At first, it was small, insignificant details. A bill missing from my wallet, a few items in my wardrobe mysteriously misplaced. I brushed it off, thinking I was careless or forgetful. But the incidents became more frequent and undeniable. Money disappeared from my wallet regularly, even though I checked it carefully every night. One day, while tidying up, I discovered a stash of small bills in Ethan's desk drawer. Ethan didn't have a job, and I was certain the money wasn't from Mark. I talked to Mark about it. I told him that money had been disappearing from the house and that I suspected Ethan. But Mark just sighed and shook his head. "Emma, maybe you're mistaken. Ethan wouldn't do that." "Mark, I'm certain. It happens every time it's just me and Ethan at home." Mark fell silent for a long moment, his expression conflicted. "I'll talk to him, okay? But Ethan has been through a lot. I don't want to make things worse." I was furious at his response, but I understood his reasoning. To Mark, Ethan wasn't just his son. He was a reminder of his late wife, the weight of his guilt. Mark felt responsible for Ethan's loss, and because of that, he could never bring himself to be strict with the boy. Even so, Mark's leniency didn't make me feel any better. I began to feel like I didn't truly belong in this family. Ethan looked down on me, and Mark avoided the subject whenever his son was mentioned. His silence left me feeling lonelier than ever. One evening, I sat in the living room, staring at the dark garden outside. Ethan had just returned from a night out with his friends. I heard him laughing as he came in, followed by the slam of the door. Moments later, he walked past me without a word. I watched his retreating figure, anger bubbling up inside me. "Ethan!" I called out, trying to keep my voice calm. "Can we talk for a moment?" Ethan stopped and turned to face me, his eyes cold. "What is it?" "From now on, I'd like you to be more careful with the things in this house. Especially, my money." He smirked, a defiant smile. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying," I said, trying to remain composed. "I just want things to be clear." "Clear?" He laughed loudly. "You think I need your money?" I opened my mouth to reply, but before I could say a word, Ethan stormed off, leaving me sitting there with unresolved anger. I didn't know what to do. Should I talk to Mark again? He would just avoid the issue as usual. I felt trapped in my own home, with no way out. I will never forget that afternoon. A day that seemed as peaceful as any other turned into a horrific nightmare. Mark had gone to work, and I was tidying up in the bedroom. When I heard a rummaging sound coming from the closet, I froze. My heart pounded. Someone was in my room. I approached, taking slow steps, trying not to make a sound. The closet door was slightly ajar, and I saw Ethan's figure. He was rummaging through things, his hands quickly gathering the money I kept in a small box. "Ethan!" I shouted, my voice full of shock and anger. He flinched, turning to look at me. His face paled for a moment, but quickly shifted to a defiant expression. "What are you doing here?" he growled. "I should be asking you what you're doing." I tried to remain calm, but my voice had begun to tremble. "Are you stealing my money?" Ethan smirked, a cold smile that sent chills down my spine. "This money isn't yours. It's my father's, and what's his is mine. You're just an outsider." I couldn't believe my ears. "What are you talking about?" "Ethan, this is unacceptable. I'm going to tell Mark." The moment I mentioned Mark's name, Ethan's eyes suddenly darkened. He strode towards me, his eyes blazing. "You dare?" His voice lowered, dangerous. "You think you have any rights in this house?" I instinctively stepped back, but Ethan blocked my path. His hand gripped my arm tightly, squeezing so hard that I felt a sharp pain. "Let go of me, Ethan!" I yelled, trying to struggle free. But he didn't let go. On the contrary, his grip tightened, as if driven by an uncontrollable rage. "Who do you think you are? You come here, steal my father, steal everything that should be mine, and now you're going to kick me out of the house?" His voice rose, his eyes wild. "What nonsense are you talking about?" I stammered, a feeling of fear beginning to constrict my chest. Ethan suddenly pushed me onto the bed. I screamed, trying to sit up, but he lunged at me, pinning my shoulders down. In my panic, I saw the glint of a small knife he pulled from his pocket. "Shut up," he hissed, pressing the blade close to my neck. The cold blade made me freeze, unable to move. "Ethan, what are you doing?" I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "Stop it. This isn't you. You don't understand anything," he shouted, his voice breaking, as if trying to justify his actions. "You don't know what I've had to endure, when Dad always treated me like a burden, when he brought you here to replace my mother." I felt the blade press harder, causing a stinging pain on my skin. A thin stream of blood seeped out from my shoulder, staining the shirt I was wearing. "I don't want to hurt you," Ethan continued, but his eyes were full of contradiction. "But you have to learn." I held my breath, feeling fear spread throughout my body. All words seemed to be stuck in my throat. Suddenly, Ethan's gaze changed. It was no longer simply anger or resentment, but something dark, full of danger. The air in the room seemed to freeze, so heavy that I felt short of breath. In my panic and desperate struggle, I suddenly heard the sharp sound of tearing fabric. My shirt, already thin, was ripped open, making me feel cold. Ethan's gaze immediately stopped there. A strange light flashed in his eyes, a mixture of astonishment, frightening delight, and a fierce look that made me freeze in place. "You think you're better than me?" Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse, so low that I had to strain to hear. But in every word, I felt the danger lurking. Before I could regain my senses, he lunged like a storm, his eyes flashing with terrifying frenzy. His hands forcefully pinned my wrists to the floor, despite my weak struggles. Ethan's overwhelming strength made me unable to resist, and I could only desperately scream, but the sound seemed to vanish in the savagery that was engulfing the room. Ethan's trembling fingers traced my face, from my cheekbones down to my chin, then stopped at my lips. I closed my eyes tightly, tears streaming down. Suddenly, he took out the small knife, the cold blade lightly grazing my skin, from my neck down to my collarbone, then stopping at my chest. I trembled, trying to hold back my sobs. Ethan looked at me, the corner of his mouth twisting into a grotesque smile, his eyes as if wanting to devour me. He leaned down, close to my ear, breathing heavily on my neck, whispering obscene words that disgusted me. Ethan's laughter echoed in the room, sometimes shrill like a screech, sometimes savage like the growl of a wild beast. In my extreme panic, I felt Ethan's rough hands tearing away the remaining pieces of fabric on my body. He looked at me with lustful and greedy eyes, like a hungry predator. He leaned down, attacking me brutally and ruthlessly. I no longer remember how long I spent in that living hell. When Ethan stood up, his face became empty, soulless, as if all emotions had been drained. He picked up the phone, took a few pictures, then looked at me, his eyes cold, without a trace of remorse. "You don't want Mark to know about this, do you?" he said, his voice low but carrying a deadly threat. "Good. We'll keep this a secret, if you know what's good for you." I lay there, my body trembling uncontrollably. Tears flowed ceaselessly, but I no longer had the strength to resist or even scream. Ethan walked out of the room, leaving me alone with overwhelming fear, deep humiliation, and a wound in my heart that I could never forget. Since that horrific night, I had become like a ghost in my own home. Every time I saw Ethan, a shiver would immediately run through my body, as if my blood had turned to ice. His presence in this house was like a sharp knife hanging over my head, threatening to fall at any moment. I did everything I could to avoid Ethan. I woke up at dawn, leaving the room in silence so as not to run into him at breakfast. I tried to stretch my work until late at night to have an excuse to stay in the study, where I felt safest. But it seemed nothing could escape his gaze, a gaze that was always following me, like a haunting shadow, from which I could not escape. Ethan was no longer the quiet young man I once knew. His previous silence had now been replaced by a kind of morbid confidence. He not only deliberately appeared wherever I was, but also frequently created situations to force me to confront him. Every time he came near, I felt swallowed by fear, a feeling of suffocation that could not be put into words. Once, when I was washing dishes in the kitchen, Ethan suddenly walked in. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, and immediately, my whole body stiffened. I tried to focus on the dishes in my hands, but I couldn't ignore his breath gently brushing against the back of my neck. "You're washing them very clean," he said, his voice soft, but with a hint of sarcasm that sent chills down my spine. I could feel him standing right behind me, so close that his breath touched my skin, making me shudder. "Ethan, get out," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, but my words came out trembling, as if I were pleading rather than commanding. Ethan didn't budge. He leaned closer, whispering in my ear, his voice hoarse, slow, like a deliberately drawn-out threat. "You remember. Just one word from me, and everything will collapse. Do you understand?" I froze. His words were like a rope tightening around my neck, making it impossible for me to breathe. The warmth from his body made me feel more suffocated than warm. I wanted to scream, to push him away, but my hands were trembling, unable to do anything but drop the plate in my hand into the sink. "Ethan, enough," I stammered, trying to banish the fear from my voice, but failing miserably. He chuckled, a light but cold laugh that made me want to cry. "You can't do anything, Emma. You know that very well. You just need to be obedient and keep quiet. Don't try to do anything stupid." I quickly put down the cup, hurrying out of the kitchen, not daring to look back at him. I heard his faint laughter echoing behind me, each sound like a knife cutting deep into my heart. My heart was pounding, and I felt like the whole house was pressing in, wanting to crush me. Cold sweat soaked my back, making me feel cold despite my hands still burning. From then on, I no longer dared to be alone in the house longer than necessary. I felt like a hunted person in my own living space, always having to be wary of every step, every glance. But ironically, Mark was constantly away on business trips, leaving me alone to face the endless nightmare. I wondered countless times how long I would have to endure this. But no answer appeared other than the helplessness that was gradually gnawing at me day by day. In recent nights, the house had become strangely alive, full of unease. During the day, everything went on as usual, but when darkness fell, the atmosphere seemed to change. I often heard small noises, like the sound of a door gently opening, slow footsteps in the hallway, then a soft click of a door closing. These sounds were not loud, but enough to make me wake up in a panic. Once, I woke up with a start in the middle of the night. I felt like someone was standing next to my bed. I lay still, not daring to move, only daring to peek around. The room was pitch black, with only a faint light from the window shining in. But I was not mistaken, a shadowy figure flashed past right beside the bed. I immediately turned on the light. It was just an empty room, with no one there except me and my own rapid breathing. I sat up on the bed, clutching the pillow tightly, a feeling of helplessness and terror constricting my chest. The next morning, I checked the whole house, but there was nothing unusual. All the doors were locked, with no signs of forced entry. Ethan also showed no change, still him with his cold eyes and terrifying smirk. I didn't know if I had imagined it, or if it was real. One late afternoon, the doorbell rang while I was busy cleaning the kitchen. It was Mrs. Carter, the kind neighbor, standing at the door with a gentle smile and a fragrant apple pie in her hand. "Hello, Emma, I brought you some apple pie," she said, her eyes looking at me intently as if searching for something. I forced a strained smile, even though the hand holding the door was already drenched in sweat. "Thank you. I love your pies." But Mrs. Carter didn't stop there. She tilted her head, her eyes showing concern. "Emma, are you all right? I heard some strange noises from your house a few nights ago. And even some shouting. Are you okay?" I froze, feeling my heart stop. I was about to say something, but just then, a deep voice sounded from behind me. "Hello, Mrs. Carter. Long time no see." Ethan appeared from the hallway, walking closer. His smile was friendly, but for me, it was a shock. My back stiffened, feeling like I had just been caught. "Oh, Ethan, you've grown so fast." Mrs. Carter turned to greet him, completely unaware of my distress. "I heard you just got into university, is that right?" "Yes, ma'am," Ethan replied, maintaining his polite smile. He glanced quickly at me, his eyes as if reminding me to keep quiet. Mrs. Carter continued talking to Ethan, but I couldn't hear their words clearly anymore. My mind was in a turmoil, and cold sweat began to run down my spine. I knew that Ethan was deliberately appearing, ruining any chance for me to tell Mrs. Carter anything. His presence, at this moment, was a wordless warning. When Mrs. Carter left, Ethan turned back to look at me, a faint smile flashing across his lips. "You're good at keeping up appearances. Remember to keep it up, Emma," he said, his voice low but full of implication. I stood there, speechless, only feeling my whole body tremble. Ethan walked up the stairs, leaving me alone with overwhelming fear. Late afternoon, I was sitting at the dining table, trying to calm myself with small sips of tea. The last rays of the day shone through the window, bathing the space in a golden light, but they couldn't dispel the heaviness in my heart. Everything in this house was unusually quiet, as if it too was silently watching my every move. The front door suddenly opened, the hinges creaking softly. I startled, turning around to see Mark walk in. He put his briefcase on the table, smiling, but his face clearly showed fatigue mixed with worry. "Emma, I'm home," Mark said, his voice gentle. "Was your day all right?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "It was fine." "Did you finish work early?" "Yeah, I wanted to come home to you," Mark replied, but his eyes were still searching. He walked closer, looking directly at me. "But you don't look well. What's wrong, Emma? You seem very strange." I lowered my head, trying to avoid his gaze. I didn't want him to notice anything, and even more so, I didn't want him to know that Ethan was the reason I felt like I was imprisoned in this very house. "It's nothing, Mark. I'm just a little tired lately," I said, my voice soft. But I knew my answer wasn't convincing enough. Mark sat down opposite me, his eyes still fixed on my face. "Emma, I don't believe that. Tell me, what's wrong?" You can share it with me. I felt my throat tighten, my heart pounding. A part of me wanted to tell him everything, but I was afraid. Afraid that Ethan would do something even more terrible. Afraid that Mark wouldn't be able to protect me. Just then, I sensed a presence behind Mark. I looked up and saw Ethan standing in the doorway leading to the kitchen. He was staring intently at me, his eyes ice cold. A faint smile appeared on his lips, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Then, as if to emphasize his warning, Ethan raised his hand to his throat, making a slashing motion across it, his eyes never leaving mine. My whole body froze. The atmosphere in the room seemed to thicken, every breath becoming heavy. Mark didn't notice anything, only looked at me with concern. "Emma, are you all right?" he asked again, his voice warm but full of suspicion. "I'm fine," I said quickly, my voice trembling, trying to maintain a calm appearance. I just haven't been sleeping well. It's probably nothing." Mark looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, but you have to promise me, if something is wrong, you have to tell me right away, understand?" I nodded, not daring to say anything more. He stood up, walking to my side, placing his hand on my shoulder as a comforting gesture before leaving the room to go upstairs. Ethan, still standing there, waited until Mark was completely out of sight before walking in. He leaned down close to me, his cold voice whispering in my ear. "Very good, Emma. You're more cooperative than I thought." I didn't answer, only lowered my head, my hands gripping the edge of the table tightly so as not to reveal my trembling. Ethan left afterward, but the threatening atmosphere he left behind still pervaded the room. I sat there, trying to catch my breath, but the feeling of helplessness and fear clung to me relentlessly. In the days that followed, I sank deeper into the abyss of fear and helplessness. Ethan was no longer simply a haunting ghost, but had become a force controlling my every step, every thought. He knew how to maintain his power through subtle but effective threats. Ethan became increasingly blatant. He didn't hesitate to appear suddenly when I was alone, creating moments of constant tension. Once, when I was doing laundry in the laundry room, Ethan suddenly walked in, standing right in front of the door, blocking it. "You're working very hard," he said, his voice laced with mockery. I tried not to look at him, focusing on folding the clothes. "Get out, Ethan," I said softly, trying to keep my voice calm. But Ethan didn't leave. He moved closer, sitting down next to me. "I think you're forgetting something, Emma," he whispered. "I'm the one who decides everything here. You know that, don't you?" My body froze, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I didn't dare respond, only lowered my head, feeling like my throat was tightening. "You're good at hiding things," he continued, his eyes flashing with danger. "But don't forget, I'm always here to remind you what will happen if you dare open your mouth." Ethan walked away, leaving me sitting on the floor, tears streaming down my face. I couldn't escape his control, couldn't find any way out. Ethan's actions not only terrified me but also began to attract the attention of the elderly couple next door, Mr. and Mrs. Carter. One evening, when I was trying to finish dinner quickly to avoid Ethan, the doorbell rang. I opened the door and saw Mrs. Carter standing there with a warm smile but worried eyes. "Hello, Emma, are you all right?" she asked. "I heard some loud noises from your house a few days ago. Is everything okay?" Her question was like a direct hit to the fear hidden deep inside me. I tried to smile, but my voice faltered as I replied, "It's nothing, Mrs. Carter, I just accidentally dropped a few things." But before I could say anything more, Ethan appeared in the hallway behind me. "Hello, Mrs. Carter," he said, the smile on his lips disturbingly fake. "Long time no see. How have you been?" Mrs. Carter was slightly startled but quickly returned Ethan's greeting. Her eyes glanced at me again, as if trying to read something from my face. "If you need any help, don't hesitate to tell me," she said, her voice full of undisguised concern. Ethan only smiled, but his eyes darted quickly towards me, a wordless warning. When Mrs. Carter left, I stood still by the door, my hands gripping the doorframe to keep myself from collapsing. "You're very good," Ethan said, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "Remember to keep up appearances, Emma." Mark no longer ignored the changes in me. One evening, when he returned home earlier than expected, he saw me clearing the dinner table, my trembling hands dropping a plate onto the floor. "Emma, are you okay?" "You've been very different lately," Mark asked, his eyes worried. I quickly bent down to pick up the plate, trying to hide my confusion. "I'm fine, honey. I'm just a little tired." "Emma," Mark walked closer, his voice more serious. "What's wrong? If there's something, you have to tell me." I looked up, about to open my mouth, but just then, Ethan walked down the stairs. He stood leaning against the railing, looking directly at me. Then, as if to emphasize his control, he raised his hand to his throat, making a slashing motion across it. My whole body froze, feeling like the air in the room had been sucked away. "I'm fine," I stammered, trying to maintain composure. "I'm probably just overworked. I'll rest early." Mark looked at me, his eyes full of suspicion. But at my silence, he only sighed, then placed his hand on my shoulder. "All right, but if anything happens, you have to tell me. I'm always here for you." I nodded, feeling like every word he said was stabbing deeper into the pain in my heart. When he turned and walked away, Ethan was still standing there, the faint smile on his lips like a reminder that I had no other choice. I began to realize that I couldn't continue like this. The fear of Ethan had taken root in my mind, making me no longer dare to think of resisting. But with each passing day, I saw more clearly that my silence was only making things worse. I needed a way out, but did it really exist? One afternoon, as I was trying to focus on preparing dinner, the doorbell rang. I startled, a feeling of unease creeping in as I considered the possibility of Ethan finding another way to threaten me. But when I opened the door, I saw Mr. and Mrs. Carter, the elderly couple from next door, standing there with gentle smiles. "Hello, Emma, are you busy? We made some fresh apple pie, and thought you and Mark might enjoy it," Mrs. Carter said, her voice soft. I nodded, forcing a smile, but the hands holding the door were still trembling. "Thank you. I'm really grateful." Mrs. Carter stepped inside, her eyes quickly scanning me, as if searching for something. "Emma, are you all right? You've seemed a little different lately. The other day, I even heard some loud noises coming from your house at night. Is everything okay?" Her question made me freeze. My heart pounded, and I felt like my throat was tightening. I knew Mrs. Carter was trying to help, but her unexpected appearance only made me more afraid. I couldn't tell the truth, couldn't let Ethan know that I had said anything to anyone. "No, it's nothing, Mrs. Carter," I stammered, lowering my head. "I just dropped a few things. I'm sometimes very clumsy." Mrs. Carter placed her hand on mine, a warm but also worried touch. "Emma, you know, if anything is wrong, you can always tell us. Don't suffer alone." "I'm really fine," I said quickly, trying to smile, but my eyes darted towards the hallway, afraid that Ethan would appear at any moment. "Thank you, but I'm okay." Mr. Carter, who had been standing silently until now, took a step forward. He didn't say anything, only looked at me with a serious expression, as if he was reading every expression on my face. "Emma, you don't have to answer right away. But you should know that we're here anytime you need us." I nodded, trying to hide my anxiety. "I know, thank you both so much. I'll call if I need anything." Mrs. Carter sighed softly, her eyes revealing a mixture of doubt and concern. "Emma, remember that. We're always here." I saw them to the door, closing it tightly as soon as they left. Leaning against the door, I felt like my legs had lost all strength. All the pent-up emotions surged out in a long breath. They wanted to help, but I didn't dare, couldn't tell the truth. Ethan wouldn't let it go if he knew I had said anything. I walked towards the kitchen, my eyes blankly staring at the wall in front of me. Inside me was an endless battle. One part of me wanted to speak up, to seek help from the elderly couple, from the police, from anyone who could free me. But the other part was strangled by fear. Ethan didn't just threaten me with words. His gaze, every small gesture, were silent warnings that I must not resist. I knew that this silence wouldn't solve anything, but it was all I could do to survive at this moment. I could only hope that, somehow, someone would see what I was trying to hide. I will never forget that night. The small kitchen, a place where I once found peace, now became a battlefield of panic and fear. Ethan stood blocking my way, his eyes ice cold. In his hand was the small knife I had seen before, the sharp blade gleaming under the dim yellow light. "What do you think you can do, Emma?" His voice rang out, deep and threatening. "You should know, anyone would believe me over you." A son falsely accused by his stepmother sounds plausible, doesn't it? I stepped back, feeling like the entire kitchen was shrinking, suffocating the air around me. My back hit the kitchen counter, there was no way to retreat. Ethan took another step forward, the knife in his hand gently rising, like a warning. "You can't do this forever, Ethan," I tried to say, my voice trembling but still maintaining a bit of composure. "Someone will find out. You can't hide it forever." Ethan laughed, a dry laugh echoing in the silent space. "You're right, but that's a problem for later. Right now, I'm in control." Just then, police sirens wailed from outside. Red and blue lights flashed in the darkness, illuminating the kitchen through the window. Ethan froze, his eyes widening. Loud knocks echoed on the door, and before Ethan could react, the front door was forced open. Police officers stormed in, guns drawn, and pointed directly at Ethan. "Drop the weapon! Hands up!" A loud voice rang out. Ethan panicked, the knife falling to the floor with a clatter. He turned his head to look at me, his eyes filled with a confusion and panic I had never seen before. Two police officers quickly restrained him, handcuffing him before he could do anything. I stood motionless, my body frozen, not daring to believe what had just happened. A female officer approached me, her voice gentle. "You're safe now. Don't worry, we've been monitoring this situation for a while." How did you know?" I stammered, my voice hoarse from fear and exhaustion. "Your neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, reported it to us," the female officer said. "They noticed unusual signs from your house. Their camera, positioned towards the kitchen window, recorded undeniable evidence." Her words made me burst into tears. I didn't expect the elderly couple to secretly help me in such a courageous way. Their camera had recorded everything: Ethan's threatening gaze, the times he held the knife to me, and the cruel words he often used to control me. As Ethan was being led out, I heard him shout, his voice full of anger, "You'll pay for this. I didn't do anything wrong." But those words no longer held any weight. I knew I was free. My legs went weak, and I slumped to the kitchen floor. Tears streamed down my face, this time not from fear but from relief. A moment later, Mrs. Carter walked in, followed by Mr. Carter. She ran to my side, taking my hands in hers. "Emma, you're all right now. Don't be afraid anymore. We're here now." I couldn't say anything, only nodded, my eyes blurred with tears. Their presence, along with what they had done to help me, was the only light that had guided me out of the darkness all this time. I sat silently in a chair, my hands clasped together, trembling in the bright white light of the police station. My heart pounded in my chest, not from fear, but from a mix of relief and emptiness as the truth was finally exposed. Mark walked in, his face pale, his eyes filled with confusion. He walked straight to me, but stopped just a step away. I didn't dare look him in the eye, only stared down at the floor, a heavy weight pressing on my shoulders. "Emma, what is this?" His voice trembled, almost choked. I raised my head, my eyes blurred with tears. "Mark, I'm so sorry." I've wanted to tell you for a long time, but I couldn't. Mark looked at me, unblinking. The confusion and pain in his eyes made me feel like I was being torn apart. A police officer approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Mark, we have some evidence that you need to see," the officer said, leading him to the next room. I watched him go, feeling like each of his steps was leading him to face a nightmare. When Mark returned, his face was even paler, his eyes filled with shock and pain. He sat down beside me but didn't say anything for a few minutes. I could feel the turmoil within him through his heavy breaths. "Emma, everything they said, is it true?" he whispered, his voice broken. I nodded, tears welling up again. I didn't know what to do, Mark. I tried, but Ethan, he threatened me, controlled me. I couldn't speak. Mark sat in silence, his hands cradling his head, as if trying to keep himself from collapsing. Oh God! How could I not see? How could this happen in our own house? His voice broke, filled with self-reproach. Emma, it's all my fault, Mark continued, his voice heavy with guilt. I wasn't brave enough to talk to him. Even when you said something was wrong, I just convinced myself that everything would be all right. But it was all because I was cowardly. Because I didn't want to admit that I had ruined his life. I looked up, seeing the deep pain in Mark's eyes. Mark. Mark sat there, his gaze distant, as if looking into an endless void. I failed, Emma. I failed you, and Ethan too. I thought I could make it up to him after what happened to his mother. But my indifference, my blindness, pushed this whole family into this situation. I looked at him, feeling both pity and anger. Mark, it's not just your fault. I was silent too. I wasn't strong enough to speak up sooner. No, Emma. Mark shook his head, his voice choked. It's all my fault. From the beginning, I didn't pay enough attention to you, not enough to realize that you were crying for help. I was so busy running away from my guilt about Ethan that I forgot that you also needed to be protected. His words made my heart feel heavier. I didn't know what to say to comfort him, because I knew that Mark's self-reproach wouldn't easily disappear. On the way home, Mark didn't say a word. He sat silently behind the wheel, his eyes pensive. When we arrived home, he stopped in front of the door, turning to look at me. Emma, I promise, from now on, I won't let you suffer alone anymore. Whatever happens, I'll be on your side. I nodded, but deep down, I knew that the journey to healing for both of us would be very long. But at least, it was a start. Life after that fateful night was not easy for anyone in our family. Ethan had to face the consequences before the law, and I, the one who was harmed, also had to learn how to move past the pain he left behind. But in those dark days, I realized that light still existed, from Mark's love, from the help of those around us, and from the very strength I found within myself. Mark was no longer the man who was always busy, immersed in work. He changed completely, as if this shock had awakened him from a long dream of indifference and blindness. He spent most of his time at home, taking care of me meticulously. He patiently waited for me to open up, listening to the secrets I had kept hidden. Emma, I'm so sorry for everything that happened, Mark said, his voice deep but filled with pain. We sat together in the soft light of the bedside lamp, his shadow stretching across the opposite wall, like the very self-reproach that was consuming him. I looked up into his eyes. They were no longer the eyes of the confident, mature husband I once knew. Instead, there was torment, regret, and a pain he couldn't hide. I didn't realize what you were going through. I didn't protect you, he continued, his voice choking. I gently squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin, but also noticing that his hands were trembling slightly. Mark, I'm also at fault. I was silent for too long, letting things go this far, I said, my voice shaking. He shook his head, his eyes as if wanting to drown me in a pain I couldn't deny. No, you're not at fault, he replied softly, his voice dropping to a whisper. Then suddenly, he pulled me into his arms. Mark's hug was tight, as if he was afraid that if he let go, I would disappear. The warmth from his body spread, soothing the deep wounds within me. I could feel his strong heartbeat, like a reminder that he was here, and would always be here. "I won't let you suffer alone anymore," Mark whispered in my ear, his voice tinged with deep pain but also full of determination. I gently closed my eyes, not needing to say anything more, because I knew that this hug, these words, were the beginning of the healing that we both needed. Mark began to learn how to balance work and family. He planned evenings for us to cook together, walk in the park, even participate with me in therapy sessions. He wanted to understand more about my emotions, about how the trauma had affected me. Ethan was sentenced to prison with a sentence appropriate for what he had done. But even in that situation, Mark didn't abandon his son. Every week, he spent time visiting Ethan, bringing books, words of encouragement, and most importantly, forgiveness. "Ethan, I know things can't go back to the way they were, but I hope you will use this time to reflect, to rebuild your life," Mark said during one visit. I heard him recount this, and I heard pain and hope in his voice. Ethan began to change. He sent me letters, one by one, with sincere apologies. Once, he wrote, "Emma, I know that no words are enough to make up for my mistakes. But I want you to know that I regret every day for what I did. I lived in hatred and resentment for too long, and now I only wish I could start over." Those letters gave me a lot to think about. At first, I didn't dare to read them all, but Mark encouraged me, saying that forgiveness was also a way to help myself heal. With the help of a therapist and Mark's love, I gradually found myself again. At first, I felt like a weak, helpless person, but through the therapy sessions, I learned to face my fear and realized that silence was not a way to protect myself. I participated in workshops on domestic violence, telling my story to help others understand that they were not alone. I wanted to remind them that speaking up and seeking help was essential. One day, as I sat on a bench in the park with Mark, he took my hand. "Emma, you're stronger than I thought. I'm proud of you." I smiled, for the first time feeling truly relieved. "Mark, I thank you too. For not abandoning me, for being here, and for understanding me." Over time, I gradually learned to empathize with Ethan. I understood that he was not just a perpetrator but also a victim of his own loneliness and youthful mistakes. I couldn't erase what he had done, but I could forgive, because forgiveness was the only way for me to find peace again. Our story was not just a lesson for Ethan, for me, and for Mark, but also for anyone trapped in the cycle of pain and self-reproach. We all understood that, although we couldn't change the past, we could choose how to move forward and become better people. I stood in the gentle light of early morning, in Mark's arms, feeling the warmth from his loving hand in mine. The old wounds no longer throbbed as painfully as before, but they were still a reminder that I had gone through the darkest of days to reach this day. A new life was unfolding before us. A future where I no longer had to be afraid, where Mark had learned to put family first, and where I found the strength to protect myself as well as help others. I looked at Mark, his eyes shining with hope. "Emma, we'll rebuild from what's been broken. I promise, I'll always be by your side, no matter what happens." I smiled, for the first time in a very long time, feeling true relief. "Thank you, Mark. We won't just keep living, but we'll live better than before." From here, I decided to turn my story into a motivation for those who needed encouragement. I started writing, sharing experiences and advice so that those who had been hurt like me would know that they were not alone. I understood that overcoming the darkness was not easy, but light always waited at the end of the road. The future doesn't promise perfection, but it carries hope. And that was enough for us to continue walking, with the belief that the most beautiful things were still waiting ahead. Please subscribe to the channel and like the video to follow more compelling stories.